you, everybody, for tuning in to us on Facebook. I'm Andrew Horansky, joined by Rachel DeSell from the Cleveland PlainDealer, and we are talking about a project that we've been collaborating on for how long? A couple of weeks?
A couple of weeks, yeah.
Talking about some of the murder data that we both have been jointly combing through, and a really good, I think, combined effort between our two media organizations. I know the PlainDealer first really took a look at these serial killers, the possibility of them, last year during the whole Aliana DeFries story. How did you really get turned on to that and start asking that question, could we have serial killers in Cleveland?
Yeah, so I've kind of been a crime reporter for a long time, so I'm always interested in homicides and unsolved homicides, and I've kept a list going of unsolved homicides, particularly of women, going back to 1993, and there are quite a few of them. And Tom Hargrove from Murder Accountability Project got a hold of me last year, probably end of January, beginning of February, and was asking me questions about unsolved murders.
So he got a hold of you?
He did. He got a hold of me and said, you know, I've been looking at some national murder data, and there's some interesting things about Cleveland, and I want to ask you about it and see if you might know something about it. The data that he had was from the FBI, and he was really concerned because the data from Cleveland didn't really seem right. The number of murders were not correct, the number that were solved didn't seem correct. So he sent me what he had, and I looked at it, and then I got information from the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office on all of those cases, and we decided together to go back to about 2004 and look at the unsolved murder cases that involved women.
Was there a reason 2004 was picked? Because you mentioned you were looking back to 1993.
Yeah, that was as far back as we had really solid data about the dates, the times, the locations, the manner of death. That's when the county medical examiner's office started keeping far more data in spreadsheets that we could access. Going back before that, you have to look at handwritten records and things like that. It's much more difficult to determine whether a case was solved or unsolved, how the person was killed. So we went back to 2004 and started looking for patterns. And Tom has got far more tools at his disposal than I do. And he had noticed that there were some geographical patterns potentially, and also some other age variations that he had not seen in other cities. So we decided to gather more information on that to see what we could find out.
And the first thing you had to do was to decide among all of these homicides which ones fit the pattern of a serial killer. So things that were suspected gang activity, perhaps, in many cases gunshots, those were eliminated because, according to Tom's metric, which isn't really Tom's, which is more of an objective FBI profile type philosophy, that serial killers tend to kill at close range. They're intimate types of killing. He used the word intimate during our interview a lot. Things like strangulation, things like blunt force trauma, things like stabbing. So as you were going through the ME's data, you were, filtering out the gunshots, or some of the gunshots I know stayed in, but I know definitely with some of those hands-on types of crimes, those were ones that became suspicious to you right away.
Yeah, so I mean, we actually had to start by just figuring out which ones were solved and which ones were unsolved.
You started there.
And that's really difficult because
very hard.
Cleveland doesn't keep a record of that is public. You know, they have a book in their homicide unit where they keep track of what's solved and what's not, but other cities kind of make those records public, and it's not the case in Cleveland. So that took some work initially.
And media reports.
Which
is hard because the media doesn't always follow up on every crime either. So that even took the additional legwork of maybe this case we didn't hear of, but does that mean it was solved or not?
Correct. So we started with a couple hundred cases and ended up with around 60 or so that we were sure were unsolved. And then started looking for other patterns. You know, what were the ages of the women? Did they have any other commonalities? Were they killed in certain areas or on certain sides of town? And as Tom, helped me learn a little bit more about, there are patterns to how someone is killed. So if you kill someone with your hands or with blunt force, it is something that you're more in close range, more likely to be a method chosen by a serial killer, although there are serial killers who have used guns to kill people. And I think as I started to read through the cases about the women, I started to see some other commonalities. There was a lot of women who had tough luck. They were very vulnerable, had either been involved with drugs or potentially with prostitution, which maybe made them victims that would be more vulnerable, and also maybe their cases wouldn't have been investigated as much or as thoroughly because people wouldn't be pushing to solve those cases all the time.
And another thing too, going by the metric of what we know about serial killings, the reason you looked at women is just because statistically speaking they tend to be much larger the victims of these types of serial killing crimes than men are. Was there another reason you looked at women in particular, or did you just not notice the same types of the suspicion of serial killing among male victims?
Sure. So for a decade or more, I've covered sex crimes a lot, and what we had learned in Cleveland was that when sex crimes went uninvestigated, more sex crimes were perpetrated. So Cleveland had a lot of serial rapists. We learned that with Anthony Sowell. We learned that with Michael Madison. And those cases often went unsolved because of the victims they chose to prey on in the rape cases and in the sexual assault cases. But there are also cases that are more highly likely to have DNA evidence, to be able to make those type of connections in. So initially one of my thoughts was, has all of the DNA been tested in these cases? And some of it has, and some of it has not.
And the huge thing with that is that what you have found, again, and also experience points to this, is that rape is often a gateway. Serial rape can become a gateway to serial killing because in the profile it's often about control, and that control from one is not necessarily enough, leading to another.
Sure, it doesn't happen all the time, but people can escalate, especially if they're not caught. They may get more bold, or they may get reckless. I think there's several different types of serial killers, and Tom and Eric kind of talked me through a little bit more of that. And they were kind of hesitant to say they know exactly what those patterns would be, and Eric was really clear that what you really need to do is look at the case files. Someone needs to be looking at these case files, and in fact they were both insistent that any information we turned up be shared with Cleveland Police because they wanted to make sure that someone looked into it. They wanted to make sure that the police knew what we had found and that they had the option to take action.
So there was some interesting data on many levels, but one of the things I wanted to talk about was the age range, and that was something that Tom found unusual when again, for those tuning in, the Murder Accountability Project, Washington, D.C. based, Tom Hargrove. I can't really say he's retired because he's probably working harder now than he did when he was an investigative journalist.
He was a former reporter, and he knew.
With advanced degrees and a strong aptitude for numbers and statistics and computer programming, some of the things he did in his career, have changed laws. So I know that he was very versed at being able to look at something like this. But the Murder Accountability Project, which by the way has the largest database of unsolved murders anywhere in the country, and that includes, I believe, government agencies too, he was able to develop that and an algorithm that looked at the data like the kind that the PlainDealer collected last year, and was able to find patterns in that. So we knew that there were women who were victims of suspected serial killers, but then we also found another pattern, that the women weren't the typical type of victim. They weren't the 20-year-olds, the teenagers that sometimes Tom says tend to be more typical victims. They were actually a little bit older. And when did you make that discovery? What was that like for you? Because that too is something that's an interesting data point.
Yeah, so it was Eric Witzig, who used to work for the DC Metro Police, works with Murder Accountability Project, and also has a lot of training and worked with an FBI program that helped identify patterns in serial killings. He said it was odd to him, and he really thought someone should look at the case files, that a number of the unsolved murders involved older women who were often killed in their homes and strangled or with blunt force trauma, and that those were unusual killings anyways, and that someone really needed to look at those and see if there were links with other sexual assaults or other patterns in those areas. The interesting thing about that too is that those cases all weren't in one area. They were kind of spread a little bit throughout the city. It was the age and the type of killings that linked them together.
And so there was that. The other thing that was a pattern were the clusters. And by the way, I wasn't ignoring you. I wanted to bring some of our viewers into the conversation, so I was logging on to... There are. But the other thing too is that he noticed clusters, and that is something too that was unique to what the data was able to uncover, that there were parts of East Cleveland where the killings seemed to be more common than others.
So initially, when we looked at a map, he was very interested in the East 93rd Street area, which at the time a lot of people were looking at. There was a lot in the news after Aliana DeFries was killed. You know, as was in your story, Christine Malone, and there was Jasmine Trotter. There's a lot of homicides in that area. But another thing that we discovered was that there was
that's blocks from Soul too, the Soul House.
Yeah, there was another corridor kind of running along Euclid Avenue from the east side of Cleveland into East Cleveland, where a number of women were killed. And it just so happened that when we looked more into those cases, a lot of those women had had records for soliciting, which maybe gave them a common link that we didn't know had been examined before.
Yeah, putting them more at risk because of what they do. It's interesting, Paula's saying, I can't believe that information is not public. Yeah, well, welcome to journalism in Cleveland at times. People mentioning some of the popular, serial killers. We know people like Dahmer. And seems like an increase of serial killers in Cleveland. I think that is an interesting point, too, that Carmen made, and something that we specifically talk about tonight in our story at 11, that we know that the longer that these crimes go unsolved, the more license it gives to serial killers, and the likelier they are to possibly strike again because they're better at doing it and possibly covering it up. So let me ask you just first, before we go into that, I mean, do you believe the theory? Do you think that there has to be a serial killer here? Statistically looking at it, I mean, I guess we're subscribing to the story and we're looking at the data and we're going with a leading national expert who is saying yes, absolutely, and an FBI support to that too. It's certainly possible.
Well, I think it's happened before, which also makes it seem possible. I believe that the work that Tom has done can and has in the past spotted these patterns.
Patterns that police never caught, particularly in Gary, Indiana, and getting people to look at cases that maybe were overlooked. So
I do think that you have to go into the cases and do that actual work. So what they have are addresses and manners of death and locations and things like that to look at and data. But you still have to go into the case files. You still have to do that work. And I know that there are detectives and investigators doing that now and trying to figure out whether those are those patterns. And one of the things that I've heard from a lot of Cleveland police that I've talked to that deal with homicide is that, listen, we would love to solve these cases.
Sure.
We don't have enough people, and some of these cases, if we could give them a second look, if we could give them a week or two of work, we might actually be able to solve them anyways. And it's sad because the questions that you're raising, the questions that Tom raised, those could be answered with a little bit more resources. And the families you talk to, the families that I've talked to, this is going on in their life. This lingers. It causes such harm to them that it's hard to understand why we as a community don't dedicate more resources to figuring out the answer to these questions.
The 5-year anniversary for the Malone family and then the Trotter family as well, happening this year, this spring, actually this month. But the first part of it, the serial killer, if you believe that the theory is true, that there are serial killers, or as Tom's saying, as many as 3 serial killers, the next thing we know is that serial killers improve the craft, are likelier to strike again, and that your inability to solve homicides, he believes, leads to more homicides. And that's something that I think is a huge public awareness piece in all of this, because if in fact, as we found 61 cases, if those are in fact the work of serial killers, or at least a fraction of them, that is something to be concerned about. And some people saying that maybe it's always been going on, just not noticed. Is Cleveland going to put something in place to make public the number of unsolved cases it has? These are all fantastic questions that we don't have the answers to, but we're hoping that our reporting can get answers to.
Sure. I know that when the department decided to have a homicide review task force, there's perhaps some conversations about getting more public input, getting tips on some of these cases. And you would think that in order to do that they would need to tell people which cases are unsolved and who to call if you have information. The DC Metro Police Department, they have a website that has a flyer for each unsolved case and then a number to detective if you have any information on it. And so I think that would mean a lot to families to know that information's out there, that the case is unsolved, and perhaps information
And
would
that
help.
even came out with the FBI, though, I remember in DC, that if they're not solved, even the likelihood of reporting them can go down because there isn't necessarily the same kind of trust, which is unfortunate.
And when you take a second look at a case, or when you spend some more time with it, so after the Anthony Sowell thing, the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office got a grant, and they started looking at cases within a couple miles of the house on Imperial Avenue. And they were pretty certain they would link some more cases to him, and they didn't. But what they did was they they solved other homicides just by testing some evidence and looking at them.
Not the one they were looking for, but other
one
ones.
that was linked to some serial homicides in, I think, the Columbus area.
Wow.
So it can be done if you have the resources, you have the time, you're able to do the testing.
But it's about manpower. It's about the will to do it. And some people are saying that, the 59% clearance rate from 2016 with the FBI, certainly that is alarming. So I know we're going to both continue to keep working at this, hoping that some of these numbers can lead to some answers. I know you mentioned the homicide unit. That was only last year that the Cleveland Police Department determined that, right? That was established just last year.
Well, they have a homicide unit,
detectives,
and
obviously,
had,
the special task force. I'm sorry, my
so
terms.
they had 13 detectives in there, and to have 13 detectives doing 130-something cases is kind of an impossible task, especially with the amount of time it takes to investigate a lot of homicides. Some of them you can solve really quickly, but a lot of them take more time than that. And so I think the mayor and Chief Williams decided that they were going to have a special homicide review group. They asked the FBI for help. They asked I think the county sheriff's office and the prosecutors for help. And so they kind of got a little unit together to start looking at some cases to see if they could, bump up those numbers and solve some more cases for the community. What we haven't heard yet is what the results of that have been.
Right, and they probably need some time, but if we're coming on a year, that might be a good time for us to follow up.
It's been about 6 months or so since I think they got going.
Got it. Well, Rachel, thank you for coming in and talking to us about it. And thank you so much for your help with this. It was great to collaborate with you. I do really very much admire your work, so it was very cool to work with you. And I know this isn't the end of it. There's so many places to take this. I mean, whether we look more closely at the elderly situation, and like as you pointed out, just the ratio of detectives to cases, that too is another statistic that definitely is in need of closer scrutiny. So, thanks.
All right, thank you.
Yep. And the raid kits too. So.